the next fallacies that are in your book, which are fallacies of presumption. So let's just look at the definition first. What are fallacies of presumption? So the definition that your book provides is that these are fallacies in which the conclusion depends on a tacit assumption that is dubious, unwarranted, or false. So in plain English, what that means is that what tacit assumption basically means is that you have an argument or what appears to be an argument, but in the build up of that argument, in the ingredients that are used in that argument, for example, maybe the premises or something, there is some underlying assumption. Okay, and that assumption is put in such a way that it appears something that is, it doesn't appear that obvious. It is implied, is what it means. And obviously the problem with this whole argument is, which is why it's a fallacy, is that it is that assumption is wrong, it's dubious, it's unwarranted, and it's not correct. Okay, so these unproven assumptions, and the reason that they're false, or the reason that they are unwarranted, is because obviously they're not based on reason, right? So but yet they are still very crucial for the conclusion, so they're very relevant. So ऐसा नहीं है कि ये जो assumptions होंगी वो related नहीं होंगी conclusion के साथ. They will be, but it's just that they won't be based on reason or rationale. Okay, so they can be deliberate or they can be an oversight, which is that it could be a mistake on part of the person who's making the argument, or it could also be deliberate, like deliberate in the sense कि जानबूझकर कोई इनको ऐसे शामिल कर सकता है. Okay, we'll see some examples and it will be more clear. But nonetheless, often these fallacies go unnoticed because the reason being that all these assumptions are relevant to the conclusion, right? So they're put in such a way that the argument entirely depends on these assumptions, but it goes without saying that they are incorrect. Okay. So that was the general category of fallacies of presumption. So let's just look at the first subcategory, which is P1, which is accident. So what is accident in terms of fallacies? So it's a fallacy in which a generalization is mistakenly applied to a particular case to which the generalization does not apply. Okay. So what's happening here is that you have something which is generally believed to be the case. Okay, so for example, it could be, I could say that all crows are black. Okay, so that's a generalized kind of statement, because usually what we see in most instances is that crows are black. Okay, crows, I mean kave. Okay, so crows are black usually, but that does not mean that every crow that flies in this world is black. Okay, so I can't, based on this information or the information that I've seen so far or witnessed so far, I cannot say that every crow is black. That would be a misleading thing to say. This is what an accident is. So you have a generalized understanding of something, but you put that understanding to all cases, to apply it to all cases. And that is not the correct way to go about it. Okay, so let's see some examples. So like I said, we know that generalizations are not always true, but it is possible for them to be largely true. Like I said, like it is very large. It is true in most instances that crows are black. Okay, but let's look at this example, which is provided in your book, I think. So it says that all birds can fly, right? So when we think of birds, we think of these flying creatures, right? So, but however, there are some exceptions to that rule. There are birds that don't fly. Can you think of some birds that don't fly? For example, penguins can't fly, but they are birds, right? So a fallacy of accident basically arises when these exceptions are ignored. So the key word here is exception. So there are always exceptions. And when you ignore those, a fallacy of accident arises. Okay. So there are some more common examples. So for example, exercise is good for you. Okay, exercise is good for you. We all know that doing exercise is good for us, but can we say that is always the case, right? So what if you are a very sick person, or you have a heart disease, Can you say the same to that someone who has a heart disease, that exercise is good for them? No, you can't, because maybe exercise would result in making that person more sick, right? So it's also the fallacy of accident in that sense. Again, it is illegal to cut someone with a knife. True, it is illegal to cut someone with a knife in most cases, but can you think of a case where this does not hold true? Yes, I can. What do surgeons do? Right? It's not illegal what they do. They perform surgeries on patients, and that is perfectly legal because they're allowed to do that. So you cannot say that it is always illegal to cut someone with a knife. So keep that in mind, guys. Keep the way that I remember this is through exception. So there are always exceptions, and if there are exceptions, then you're committing a fallacy of accident. Okay. So the question that I want to ask you is, what is the difference between a hasty generalization and a fallacy of accident? So if you remember what the hasty generalization is, I think I discussed it in the last lecture. So it was when we went from a one particular case and we generalized and said that this is applicable to the entire class of things, right? But over here, in what we're doing in fallacy of accident is that we're taking the entire class of things, something that is generally believed to be the case, and we're applying it to all the individual cases. Okay, so we're committing a fallacy of accident. So basically, they're essentially the inverse of each other. Again, I'll repeat, hasty generalization is applying a specific rule to a general situation, whereas in an accident, applying a general rule to a specific instance. Okay, moving on, let's look at P2, which is complex question. So let's look at the definition first. It's an informal fallacy in which a question is asked in such a way as to presuppose the truth of some conclusion buried in that question. Okay, so now we're dealing with a question. Okay, so we're talking about questions. Sometimes the way to understand this is that sometimes we ask questions, and what we're trying to get done or proposed through that questions is already like in that question somehow. So for example, what we're trying to prove is already buried there in the question, but still we're asking that question. It's a very loaded question, if I may say it that way. Okay, let's look at some examples of it, or I think it's going to be more clear when I go through the examples. So let's just read what this slide says. So when one tries to force a conclusion on someone by asking a question in such a way that the person who answers either yes or no will always admit to something he did not want to admit to. Okay, so you're basically not giving an option to the other person. You're already implying, you're already concluding something, or you're already reaching a conclusion through the question. Okay, so the argument takes the form of a loaded question. Like I said, it's obviously it's rhetorical because you're already implying something. It's implicit what the conclusion in the question. Let's look at these examples. So have you stopped beating your wife? So when I ask that question uh, to someone, so what is implicit in that question? I'm already concluding that the person that I'm asking this question is already beating his wife, right? Because otherwise, why would I say that you stop beating your wife? So the question obviously in itself contains something. It's implicit, it's loaded. Second example is, look at this. So the lawyer, he says, the figures seem to indicate that your sales increased as a result of these misleading advertisements. Is that correct? So the witness says, they did not. But the lawyer says, but you do admit then that your advertising was misleading. How long have you been engaging in practices like these? So, even police and investigations kind of use this fallacy to get stuff out of people, because you throw questions at them, and in those questions what you're trying to get out of the other person is already in there. It's implicit. Okay, so it's very interesting. So just check it out on your own also, what this is. Okay, so the P3 is begging the question. It's again an informal fallacy in which the conclusion of an argument is stated or assumed in any one of the premises. So this one's pretty basic, and it's a very common fallacy. Even a lot of philosophers make it, and some very acclaimed philosophers also do it without realizing it, obviously. So basically what it is, it's circular reasoning. Okay, so you end where you begin. So the premises are the conclusion, and the conclusion is also the premise. So it's mumbo jumbo in that sense. It's all mixed up. So when the conclusion is nothing but a paraphrase of the premise, both have the same content. Okay, so let's look at some examples. So this is, it's said that it's a claim by a 16th century Chinese philosopher, but look at what it says. There is no such thing as knowledge which cannot be carried into practice, for such knowledge is really no knowledge at all. So, what is the problem with this so called argument? The reason that I say that it's so called is because it's a fallacy. Because what the person is saying in the premises is exactly what the person is saying in the conclusion. So, it's circular in that sense. The reasoning is circular. There is no reasoning as such, it's just a repetition of what the premises are stating. The conclusion is just a paraphrase of that. Okay, so there are more examples of this. For example, let's just look at this one. Smoking cigarettes can kill you because cigarettes are deadly. So what's happening here is that the conclusion that the cigarettes are deadly is also the premise, which is smoking cigarettes can kill you, and vice versa, right? So it's the same thing. So it's circular argument. There's no new reasoning being given. It's just the same reasoning, and that's just being converted to the conclusion. Similarly, everyone wants the new iPhone because it is the hottest new gadget on the market. So we already knew that the new iPhone is new. Obviously, they've told us that. And then they're also saying that it's a new gadget on the market. That's why you should buy it. So it doesn't make sense because it's again circular reasoning. Okay. So that is very interesting. It's called begging the question. And obviously, there are more complicated instances of this. Sometimes people make these arguments, profound arguments, but they don't realize what they're doing. And the reasoning is circular.